Now, on the topic of Black Supremes, I have always been of the belief that the Coven has had at least one or two of them, and that's just based on the Coven's very long history alone. And of course, since it is still Black Witch Month, I'm definitely going to cover how I think that might be and what a series on that might look like. Now, in my video entitled All of the Supremes, I detail every single Supreme that we learn about from 1500 starting with Skahawk to 2018 ending with Mallory. And so there's a couple of gaps in that timeline, and I think this is room for those Black Supremes to come in. Unfortunately, based on where these gaps are located in the timeline, these Supremes would have always been reigning during a treacherous time. They could have been reigning in the 1700s post-migration. It could also be reigning in the early 1900s up until Mimi de Longpre takes over in the 20s, or they could have been reigning during the 1950s pre-Annalie Layton. Now, I do like to believe that as some of the most powerful witches in the world, the Supremes, whoever they were, whatever race, would have had a command of their covens. But given the Coven's history and some of the conversations that we as the audience got to be privy to towards the Voodoo House, we know that at least a number of the Coven's members were likely racist. Keep in mind, and I've mentioned this in my video talking about the Coven's history, and I think it's titled The Coven's History, that there is a high probability that the Coven was the home of many racist witches. And I say this because one of their Supremes, Marianne Wharton, was the reigning Supreme during the Civil War. Now, I don't know if that would have put her at around the same time that Delphine was alive. I don't know how long this particular Supreme lived. It would have been easier had we known what Supreme followed her. But given that, they likely would have been running in the same circles. She likely would have used her magic to elevate herself and her coven, which is very possible, and we don't know the mentality of every single Supreme, so it wouldn't shock me if some of them, based on the time they were living in, were definitely racist. In fact, we have no evidence of a Black witch in that episode with the Axemen when we first meet that character, so again, I'm sure they stuck to the social norms. Thank the Targaryen dynasty, they only really want to make change for themselves kind of things. They definitely participate in the economy. They definitely do things to protect the Coven. And if that means subjugating other witches, or at least finding reasons to diminish their belonging in the Coven, I can see a lot of them doing that and taking that route. So this might not always be the case. Again, this is me making an assumption, but based on the time they were living in, I definitely don't see all of the witches in the Coven or some of the Supremes being as supportive of their Black members. Now, one of the things I think would be really interesting to explore, though, would be the dynamics between the members of the Voodoo House during whatever time the Supreme is reigning and Black members of the Coven, wherever they might be. I also think it would be a really cool opportunity to bring in other practices from across the diaspora. For instance, hoodoo or Santeria, or maybe even the way Black Catholics practice down in Louisiana, or Black Christians in that area. And I will note that although we were only shown two systems of magic in American Horror Story, it is probably very unreasonable to assume that to be Black just inherently means you're a part of the Voodoo House. No, and I think this is why it's going to be important, or it would be important, to bring in those other practices, those other religions. And I actually really like this idea because in American Horror Story, the universe does actually expand this. We actually get Mami Wata in American Horror Stories, and then we have Behold. We don't know what his lineage is. We don't know if he's a dual descendant, but it could be anything. So I think one of the things that would be interesting to see again would just be the showcase of the dynamics between the Voodoo House and Black members of the Coven. And I think that would be really important because we know how the Coven feels about the Voodoo House and how it presents them as inferior throughout the show. To me, I could also see a Black Supreme being responsible for integrating the Coven. I could also see them setting up a boys' school as well. There is so much material you could use from that time period alone. One of the sadder things that I can see coming out of a show like this is how the members of the Voodoo House have to remind these Black Supremes, these Black witches, how they have historically been treated by their covens, whether that's disrespect of leadership, whether that's trying to illegitimize their reigns, etc., and how at the very end of it all, they have been suppressed, hidden, or forgotten about completely, scratched from the record. One of the things I think would be really cool if we ever got another season of Coven or a spinoff is the idea that maybe one of Marie Laveau's disciples or another member of the Voodoo House finds a huge scrapbook photo album in her hundreds of years worth of stuff, and they start to explore these Black Supremes and these Black witches from the Coven, and maybe at one point they did have a closer relationship and they supported each other. And then of course maybe in another season or something we can explore the rift that happened between them. Anyways, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Let me know if this is something you would watch or something you would like to see. Let me know what kind of plot lines you would like to see in a show like this, and I will see you guys in my next video.